Genesis chapter 21. I'm going to have to get this Bible fixed. Pages are starting to fall out, and I don't like that. I want to keep this same Bible I've been using for, I think I got it in 2003. Sometimes I have my small blue one up here, and I study mostly from electronic devices, and I look stuff up on the internet and different places, but I like having just a hard copy of the real word. I would probably study more from this, but I know that the more I use it, the more these pages are going to probably tear out. So if you know of a good Bible repair person, let me know. Maybe I can get this one kind of repaired. I want us to look starting at verse number 17. I won't reteach all the stuff that I shared last couple of weeks, but just to bring you up to speed, just remember what's happened here. Sarah, Abraham's wife, both of them have had their names changed from Sarai to Sarah, and from Abram to Abraham. And you remember the story, Hagar first appeared on the scene as a slave girl, servant girl to Sarah, and Sarah was up in age, barren, unable to have kids, and so custom in those days is the one born in your house was going to be the heir if there were no children between that father and wife, so husband and wife. So anyway, she said, Abraham, I'm going to give my slave girl to you. She can be your wife, and she can have a son. That'll be my son, and that way I'll have I'll have my own child. So that's the way that arrangement worked. And then later, 13 years later, when Abraham was 99 and Sarah was about to be 90 or at 90, the Lord appears and said, your wife Sarah is going to bear a son, Lord. And Abraham said, now wait a minute, I've already got this son by Hagar, Ishmael. I want him to be blessed by you. I don't want to alienate him and just forget him. And the Lord said, I'm going to bless him too. But the one that I'm really going to bless people through is going to be Isaac, that'll be born, and so to Sarah. So the story in this chapter begins. The Lord remembered Sarah. She became pregnant, 90 years of age, and had a senior adult young'un, right, named Isaac. And Abraham was 100 years old. So we remember that Hagar's son, now 13 or 14, was mocking and making fun of the little boy, and the mama, the senior adult mama, old 90-year-old, sought in her ways and didn't want anybody messing with her little boy now. And anyway, she ready to get rid of Hagar and this little boy and get them out because I got my own family. I don't need them. Let's get them out of here. And so she complained to Abraham. Abraham took it before the Lord. The Lord spoke to Abraham and said, go on and just do what she says. Just do what she says. Okay, so strange. Sometimes God may tell you something that seems that's not the norm. Well, He's God. He can do what He wants. He don't have to follow our rules of what normally takes place. So this is what happened here. And this brings us up to speed in the story. Remember, she was given the next morning a loaf of bread or some bread and one canteen of water or a jug of water of those days, and boom, sent on packing early in the morning. She didn't know where to go. She wasn't given a gift card or a Walmart card or a gas card or nothing like that. She was just given a little bit of stuff and said, go. She wasn't hauled off to some friends or family nearby, or, Abraham didn't build her a place further down the road, another house. It was just go. So she's wandering around out here, and the water runs out before they finally figure out where to go. And it got so bad, if you remember, that this little, he's probably 14 or 15 by now. This boy, it calls him a lad, a child. But at any rate, he must have got kind of in a bad way and had been without water so long that now he couldn't carry on. And she thought he was going to die. He got so bad off. And so much, I guess, from giving out, exhaustion, and now no water. I don't know if you've had to go without water before, but, I've I've been thirsty in the watermelon fields and in the farmland back when you used to hoe melons and stuff and thin them out. I don't think any of that's done today. But the water jugs would be at the beginning of the row. And sometimes a farmer would stick another jug way down on the other end. Well, you may have to hoe a row that's a quarter mile long, and then you got to turn around and hoe the other row on the way back. So you get 4 people or so, however many you had, side by side, and so you go up, you take 4 rows out, and you turn around, you come back, and you get 4 more rows, and you keep going back and forth, and you get that whole field. But most of the time, water was down at the beginning, and there would be a big communal jug. All right, in those days didn't have the plastic jugs. It was them glass jugs. Who remembers them big gallon jars, glass jugs? Anybody ever had to drink behind somebody in one of them jugs? Anybody been so thirsty you didn't care? You just wanted some water. I've been there on the other end thinking, good Lord, I'm thirsty now. I don't know if I make it all the way back. I got to hoe all the way back, you know. And if you're thirsty, the last thing you want to do is more physical labor that's going to just aggravate and add to the thirst you already got. I don't know how bad it was, but evidently it was pretty bad and worse than any thirst I've ever had, because he was just laid out pretty much and just couldn't go on. She thought he was going to die, and remember, she's broken hearted and said, I can't bear to watch him die. So she moves off a bow shot away, which, you know, I'm guessing again like I did last week, you know, 400, 500, 600 feet away, a couple of football fields away. And so she don't have to see him or hear him, because he's crying and, you know, whimpering, I guess, probably not too loud at this point if he's weak. And then she's just all tore up and can't take it anymore, and so she's weeping. And she's in anguish and bothered and emotional. And let's look at what God says in verse 17. He comes to her. God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God, Jesus in the Old Testament, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? So the first thing I want to point to you today is God's disappointment is revealed right here in this verse. God's disappointment to Hagar is revealed. Anytime somebody says, what is the matter with you? Isn't that an indication? Isn't that a revelation that the person that said it is disappointed some way? What is the matter with you? That's only said by a person that is disappointed in the person being spoken to. It's only said when a wrong behavior or a wrong response is being displayed according to the thinking of the person that makes the statement, what is the matter with you? You ever said that to anybody? Anybody ever said that to you? What is the matter with you? Isn't that true that that's the statement that reveals a level of disappointment? Well, I think so. I think this reveals that God was disappointed with her. And then in the very next part, what he says next reveals what the disappointment was. What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear. There it is. Do not fear. He was aggravated because she had gotten this fear, and it had brought to a level that was described in verse number 16 that I just talked about. She moved away. She was tore up so bad inside emotionally. She said, do not let me see him die. So she had to get away. She couldn't bear to watch. And it said she lifted up her voice and wept in verse 16. So here we see that the reason that God was disappointed in her was because of this emotion that she had allowed herself to become overcome with. You can say an emotion of fear. Fear is an emotion. What is the matter with you? Do not fear. Now, I'm trying to put myself with the mind of God here. Do not fear, Hagar. What's the matter with you? Don't you remember what happened in chapter number 16? The last time I caught you out in the wilderness and I came to you when you was in need by that spring, and when Sarah had treated you so bad, you ran away from trouble and you got out here in the woods by yourself and you was pregnant with Ishmael. Don't you remember I came to you then? Don't you remember I spoke and gave you words of encouragement again? And don't you remember I told you you're going to bear a son when you were pregnant? Don't you remember I said his name is going to be called Ishmael? Don't you remember I said his name is going to be called God Hears? That's what Ishmael means. And so every day she spoke to him and said Ishmael. She was actually saying God hears. And then when that incident ended, after I was speaking to you, don't you remember that you called me God hears or God sees? God sees, let's look back. I want to get it right here. But Ishmael meant God hears. And back in chapter 16, when she was running away from Hagar, verse 13, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. So she knew that God heard and God sees. What is the matter with you, Hagar? Didn't you learn anything then? She should have remembered. So when she left, here in chapter 21, it says in verse 14 actually, Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, put them on her shoulder and gave her, God hears, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was used up, she left, God hears, under one of the bushes. And she went and sat down opposite, God hears, about a bow shot away. And she said, do not let me see, God hears, die. And she sat down opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard, God hears, crying. And the angel of God said to Hagar from heaven, what is the matter with you, Hagar? She should have remembered. God hears. And she also, when God appeared to her before, the lesson she should have learned is her own words. God sees. And the name of that spring she was by was called God Sees. God sees, right? Isn't that what the name of that spring was? Let me turn back to it. I want to get that right. I don't want to say it wrong. The well of the living one who sees me. That's what Beer Laharoi means, that the name of that spring was given. God sees me. So, God was disappointed. She should have learned. When you and I get in situations of need, we need to reflect back and remind ourselves, God's helped me before. He sees, He hears, He's totally aware of what's going on in my life right now. Now here's another interesting thing, and that's in verse 7. Look what happens next. Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Now, why in the world, instead of saying that, why didn't he say, here's some water? And remember the story from last week. The point is, God, she went out and wept, and then it said, God heard the lad. Didn't mean He didn't hear her, but God heard the lad. He heard her as well. He knew all about her. But here, why instead of giving water right away to somebody that's about to die, does He say to her, God has heard the voice of the lad where he is? Well, He was trying to fix the supply chain, I think. He was trying to fix her. She needed help with her emotional state. She was totally under control of her emotions and unable, to do some things here. And so God gave her a word of encouragement. When He told her, God's heard him, He's aware again, she should have lit up. Oh man, I ain't worried no more. This thing's fixed. And that's probably what happened. And then look what else is true here that I noticed this morning. What else? He doesn't stop there. He gives her information. He gives her something physical to do. He said, arise, lift up the lad. I'm thinking, you know what? A lot of people that get depressed and get emotional and just get controlled by emotions, they just need to get up and do something physical, right? But here, that's what God said. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand. And then he gives her some information. For I will make a great nation of him. I will make a great nation of him. Now look at the order here. Instead of meeting the physical need, God supplies information that he wants her to know, but it's in a time of need that he gives her the information. How many of you have ever been in a situation where God just got to come through? You were just about to give up. And then when God comes through, there's a lesson attached with his provision. You ever notice that? Sometimes God has to get us in a severe crisis, a great need, in order for our spiritual ears to be able, when we can hear what he's got to teach us. See? So, he gives her information about him. And that should have been encouraging. If God's going to grow him up to be a man, he's still a boy. That means he ain't going to die as a boy. He's still got to grow up to be a man, to be a head of a nation, right? Look at what it says next. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. Provision. God gave the child water, and there was water there for her. I would say God came through, weren't you? Did God come through for her? Sure he did. Now here's another question. When did God come through? Look at what it said. God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Now, he opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. That's very much indication the water was already there. She just couldn't see it. Whew. Y'all see what I'm saying here? She was blinded from seeing what was right there that she wanted so dearly. What blinded her? Emotions. Emotion. When she got out, this wasn't a situation she created. She was forced out here. You know, she didn't get the chance to decide, do I fight, flow, or flee? It was decided for her, see? Now she's out here, and she's without provisions, and she's in great need. She can't give her only son that's with her what he needs. Looks like he's going to die, and she's about to give up, and she's overcome with emotion. Here's a good lesson. When you get in a situation that you're forced into, where you're not in control, where you can't provide, and you need God to come through, do not be overcome by your emotions, or you may get blinded for what God has already put out there before you. Now, she was blinded by fear. It's been said fear is the opposite of faith. Fear is unbelief in God. Fear means you're not really trusting God. Fear, then, I believe, is a sin. But it may not be the fear of sin that is blinding you. It may be another sin that you're dealing with. But whatever it is, sin can blind you from the provision God has already put in place for you. I believe when God created the world, this stream was created, and God said, put one right over there. A couple thousand years from now, there's a guy named Ishmael going to need this, so let's put it in place now. And get time, it'll be there. I think it was already there. But because she was blinded by her emotions, blinded because she wasn't in control of her emotions were in control of her, it was right there. How much time did she waste weeping? How much time did she waste worrying? Because herself, she was not in line. She was out of the supply chain. God wanted to bless Ishmael, and he did. But he wanted to do it through her. I'm going to remind you of what I said last week because I think it's very important. You parents who have kids, God wants you to be a provider, but he wants to be part of the supply chain. He wants you in the supply chain. It all comes from him. It may be money, it may be material things, but he's concerned about your children, your grandchildren. He wants you involved in supply chain. But if you are not in a position where you need to be in the supply chain, you may cause a delay in the need getting met of that child or grandchild or whoever it is God wants to use you for. It happened right here. I think it can still happen today. I like stuff like this. I don't know about y'all. This is getting deep in the Word for me. Some of y'all may not be that deep. You're glad when it's over and you go to the house. Well, we'll be done shortly. One more thing. Look at verse 20. A couple more things. What does it say? God was with the lad. Some people would say, well, that means from this day forward. No, I don't think so. God was there the whole time. What was his name? God hears. God was right there. He was right there. God was with the lad in verse 20 and in verse 19 and all the verses before it. God was with the lad. That's why Abraham didn't worry back in verse 14 when he sent him off. That's why he didn't give him an extra car. Here's an old pickup truck. Take it. These keys. Y'all can just go on in, throw your stuff in the back. And, he didn't do any of that. He knew God was going to take care of this boy. God had already revealed to him that he was going to be a nation, a head of a nation with 12 princes. God had already told him that. So he learned from what God had told him and shared with him. And then remember the verse let's go back to it, in chapter 17. This is important. I'm trying to find the spot. I thought I had it marked. There's a place in here, it may be as far back as chapter 12. Anyway, God is revealing somewhere in one of those chapters. You can find it later. I won't sit here and try to look for it. It's in one of those chapters where God has said, I'm going to make you a father of a great nation, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And the Bible says Abraham believed God. And then somewhere in there, it said he was considered righteous. He was considered righteous. James even reflects back on that. Remember we read that not long ago? Let me point to that in James. I can find it quicker. I know exactly where it is in James. In James is talking about faith, and he uses Abraham as an example. He said, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? You see that his faith working was with works, and as a result of works, faith is perfected. And the scripture said, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. There's a reference. It's in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And he was called the friend of God. He believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. In other words, he becomes righteous, Abraham. He was righteous because he believed God. Not because of anything he did, because remember the teaching of the Bible is our righteousness, the best we can do is this filthy rag before the Lord. But Abraham was a righteous father. That's the point I want you to see here. And then I want to refer you to the book of Psalms, and I can't remember the chapter and verse there. But David has said, I've been old, I've been young, and now I am old. And I have never seen the righteous or their children begging for bread. So, I've never seen the righteous nor their children begging for bread. You say, what does that mean? That means if you're righteous, God's going to take care of you. He's going to take care of your children. So the final point here is a good thing that Ishmael had a believing, righteous father. That's one of the reasons that God took care of him right here in this story. And For your children, fathers, the best thing you can give them is a righteous father. For your children, ladies, mamas, the best thing you can give them is a righteous mom, because God will help you be a part of the supply chain, just like he did with Hagar in this story right here. God's a good God. We've had a time of Thanksgiving, and as we move toward Christmas, we ought to keep being thankful, knowing that, hey, just because I'm a child of God, that's why Jesus said, seek ye first God's kingdom and all his righteousness, and all these needs will be added to you. It's not up to you to get the provision. It's up to you to get the provider, right? You get hooked up with the provider, the provision's always going to be there. It won't happen right away. You may have to go through a time of need. You may have to wander in the wilderness. You may have to get thirsty sometimes. You may have to get hungry sometimes, because God may want to do more than just give you a provision. In this story, he had a spiritual lesson. He had information he wanted her to know in here. Well, I hope you got something out of this story, or these stories about Hagar. And it's my prayer that all that God's shown you that you need to do in your heart, that's what you'll do in the days today and in the days to come. Let's stand together in prayer.